I'm pleased to introduce to you tonight our guest speaker, Larry Souza. Dr. Souza is former Senior Vice President of Research and Licensing at Amgen, the world-renowned biotechnology company. Dr. Souza chose to carry out his undergraduate degree at UC Berkeley and then got his doctorate at UCLA. In 1981, he joined the Amgen team, where one of his great accomplishments include inventing the biotech drug Neupogen. And what Neupogen does is it's used to decrease the incidence of infection in cancer patients, and increase, and thus helping patients better tolerate chemotherapy. In 2000, Dr. Souza retired from Amgen and has since been involved in venture capitalism in the biotech industry. So without further ado, here's Larry Souza.
Thank you. Well, I'm glad to see everybody today. My son's a senior actually on campus, and he thought it'd be better to watch the baseball game tonight than come hear his dad talk. Actually, he's got a class at 6:30, so I told him he had to go to school. At any rate, what I'd like to do today is give you a little background, both scientifically and business-wise, about the biotech industry, looking at what it looked like in the first couple decades for, about a third of the talk, and then spend about 2/3 of the talk looking at what it looks like today and going forward. So the first thing I want to go over will be tech and biotech. What's the differences between biotech and the tech industry? Second, I'll give a summary of the history of the biotech over the last 3 decades. And then finally, major factors that are influencing today's biotech market. Carry is one of them. Okay, so biotech, what are some of the major differences if you're looking at tech and biotech? Well, one of the key ones is a pipeline. Okay, and pipeline is described as some discovery that you make that comes to maturity in terms of a product, and that product gets marketed. And the tech side of thing, if you're marketing chips, software, most of those companies have a 2 to 3 year time from discovery to the market. So as a big difference, biotech and pharma, which on average is 10 to 15 years from the discovery of a drug or a drug target till that drug actually makes it on the market. Okay. So you'll see right off the bat that's going to change the whole flow of how the companies take money in, how long they're around, who they have to work with to make their money. Regulatory oversight, okay? The tech pretty much side of business doesn't have a regulatory body like biotech and pharma does. So the FDA is a regulatory body. And the FDA looks at the part of a program which in the industry we term the development. So you have research aspects and you have development aspects to the biotech side and pharma side. Research takes about 6 years. That means you discover a target that is related or associated to a disease. Once you've discovered that target, then you work on making a drug to that target. And when you get that drug, you run it through preclinical testing, which means you take animal models which hopefully resemble the disease and will show what it might do in humans. You do that, and then you go to the clinical testing. And the clinical testing itself takes another 5 or 6 years, and the approval process takes about a year. So the FDA looks over a document that you submit to it that's roughly on the order of 20 to maybe 100,000 pages of data about a drug before it's approved. So single financing versus a VC consortium. So how do these companies get funded? Well, most of the high-tech companies get funded by a single VC, and they'll take anywhere from 10 to 100 million from that single VC to get that particular product. And they gear the financing to basically get the product on the market. Patents that were being issued for monoclonal antibodies in the early 80s were issued such that they look like generic products. Okay, so the company A could get one antibody to a particular protein, company B could get another antibody to that same protein recognizing a different portion of that protein, company C. And even back then, in the 80s, it still cost over $200 million to develop a therapeutic. Today, it costs almost $800 million to bring a new drug to market. Okay. That's why, at the end we'll talk a little bit about price controls and what they would mean to the industry. But it costs a lot of money. Why does it cost so much money? Because you're paying for a lot of failures in that one success. Okay, the industry experiences, when you put a drug into the clinic, first phase clinical testing, it's about a 10% chance that that drug that enters clinical testing, that means it goes into humans, well, 10% chance that it'll make it out the other end. When it started at the bench with a bench scientist working, it had about a less than a 2% chance of being successful. So that means basically for every successful drug, there are probably on the order of 25 to 50 failures. And that's why the cost is so extraordinary. Okay, so I want to finish the story then briefly on the monoclonal antibodies. So the companies, the pharma companies said, well, if this is generic, then we don't want to put $200 million into it. Okay, the patents giving the coverage weren't exclusive enough. Okay, that changed in the early 90s. Two things changed in the early 90s. One, we made humanized monoclonal antibodies. That means the amino acid sequence of a human monoclonal antibody was exactly what a human has as its repertoire. And the second thing is companies began to get patents on the proteins that the antibodies were made to, such that they got all the antibodies that were made to a particular protein. So they didn't just get one, they got coverage for anything that another company might make. Therefore, they got good coverage. And companies like Medirex and Abgenix have survived because of that good patent coverage. Second decade. Okay, so now we're going to move from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s. Okay, in the mid-'80s to mid-'90s, technology started to change. Again, the universities developed a number of robotics technologies, high-throughput screening, combinatorial chemistry. These are ways to do things very rapidly in screening for small molecule drugs. So now for the first time, the pharma industry is seeing that the little brother is doing things very similar to what pharma was doing. So pharma starts to pay close attention now. In the 80s, the early 80s, they didn't pay close attention because they didn't really think proteins could be drugs. Okay, so companies like Amgen, Genetics Institute, Genentech, all made some of the first drugs that were protein therapeutics. And the pharma pretty much stayed away. There was some licensing. Lilly did licensing with Genentech for insulin and human growth hormone. But by and large, most of pharma said, well, we're going to stick with drugs. You guys can play with the proteins. Okay, but now all of a sudden, biotech was starting to play in their own backyard, develop tools that could make drugs be developed quicker, make drugs development even faster. So now all of a sudden, technology adoption to expedite drug research became a priority for the pharma. So now the third decade, basically the mid-'90s to 2004, that's even become more enhanced because what we see are several things. Genomics, you've all heard about. Basically, we now know the full sequence of DNA of a human, about 30 to 40,000 genes. So we know that whole repertoire of genetics. Proteomics, beginning to understand how those genes interact and interplay with each other as functional genomics. You're looking at potentially some other therapeutic modalities, antisense oligos, meaning small pieces of DNA to be used as therapeutics. That's a possibility. But the key now is drugs. So now most of biotech has turned its focus on drugs. It hasn't turned away from proteins, but the problem with proteins are there's only so many factors that are secreted by the body that control, homeostasis of a particular physiology in the body. So insulin controls sugar, neupogen controls white blood cells, epogen controls red blood cells. There's only so many hormones like that in the body, and therefore there are only so many products and they're limited. Whereas on the drug side, you're only limited by your ability to get a small molecule through a cell wall and into some intracellular target within that cell that might block a particular cascade that's involved in disease. Okay, so now there's even more accelerated interest from pharma in biotech over the last decade, because now, again, biotech is bringing more and more tools for pharma, and so there's a lot more relationship, there's a lot more contracts between pharma and biotech. Some of these contracts are for technology only, some are for products. We'll talk a little bit about that in a couple of minutes. Okay, so what are the major factors that are influencing today's biotech market? Pharma's needs. Okay, remember, pharma's a big player because pharma gives a lot of money to biotech to help them develop the drugs and ultimately market those particular drugs. And pharma right now is hurting, okay? They got a lot of drugs coming off of patents. Patents in the U.S. last 17 years. You've probably seen in the lay press a lot of discussion about drugs coming off for Merck, for Lilly, for SmithKline. And when those drugs come off patent, they have to be replaced by other drugs. So if you've got a $10 billion basis of revenue in your company, okay, and the public, the shareholders expect about a 15% growth rate, okay, at least they used to prior to 2000. Probably the mindset is still give me 15%. That means you have to introduce a new drug every year that's going to be $1 billion plus drug, right? Think about it. If you got a $10 billion basis already, like a company like, Merck's got more than that. I know Amgen, that's Amgen's basis this year is going to be $10 billion. So next year they've got to go to $11.5 billion to make sure the shareholders are satisfied and that hopefully the shares respond. The year after that, they've got to go over $13 billion. Okay? And so a blockbuster drug, there aren't many drugs that make $1 billion. Well, it gets worse. 17 years later, like a company like Merck, it has things come off patent. When they come off patent, in general, they lose half their value. So if you have a drug that's a $2 billion drug and it comes off patent, pretty much overnight, the companies that make generics are going to eat half that market. So you're going to lose $1 billion there, and you've got still the expectation that you're going to maintain as well as grow. Okay? So that's a big problem. That's why they need products. Their own research units are not innovative enough. They focus, again, most of their effort towards development and towards marketing. So now who becomes the primary partner for them in terms of innovation and the new products? The biotech community. Okay. Drugs versus biologicals, we just touched on that in a sense that there are many more drug targets than there are biologicals. So even biotech recognizes that they have to get into the drug industry. They have to begin to make small molecule drugs. Valuations, we discussed that. The valuations had gone through the roof in 99 and 2000. The valuations in these companies now is down to more reasonable valuations. In fact, some of them are depressed, and it makes it very difficult for startup companies to raise money in this environment. Basically, over the last 4 years is the toughest environment for a startup company to raise capital to get their ideas, their inventions off the ground since the beginning. Okay. Rising product development costs. You heard me say that back in the early 80s when we did Neupogen and Epogen, the average cost to get a drug to market was about $200 to $300 million. And in fact, Amgen raised from outside public entities, from different banks, from various VCs, just about $300 million before it sold its first vial of Epogen in 1989. So it had opened its doors in 1980, and the first sale of a product was 1989. And that's a several billion-dollar product today. Okay. Product pricing and reimbursement. These are two things that loom large in today's healthcare environment. Okay. If you've seen any of the debates between our two presidential candidates, you've seen a highly contested and two pretty much different views on how to move forward. But one thing I can tell you is that if it cost $800 million, it's going to be tough to cut that amount. It's going to be tough to say, go make me a new innovative drug for half that price. Part of the problem is all the innovation, or much of the innovation, occurs in the United States. So there isn't a fair share of sharing by countries in the European community as well as Canada. Okay, so let's look at the impact of pharma's needs on biotech in terms of its strategy and operations. So the next several slides are kind of geared from a perspective of if you were a potential job candidate and you wanted to learn about how to get a job in biotech and where to get the best job in biotech, the next set of slides. From my perspective as a VC, and I want to invest money into these companies, then I want to make sure what are the best possibilities to invest in, which companies have the most likelihood of succeeding, putting a drug into the clinic that's going to be successful. Okay, so the key then is for the industry, it used to be on technology. Okay, in the early 80s, you saw a company like Amgen. It raised it had its IPO basically on technology, not on products. Okay, it had a prospectus that said, yeah, we're going to clone this and we're going to clone that, but we hadn't cloned them. We hadn't even cloned the genes yet, let alone made the proteins or tested them in an animal model. So people were, betting on a promise of the technology. Today, the promise is on the drugs. Basically, the VCs are saying, show me the drug. Okay, don't show me this great technology that's going to cost me $20 million and may or may not get a drug. Okay, that's the same stance that pharma's taken. Pharma's saying, I can't afford to spend any more of my dollars in licensing technology. I have to license products. So now all of a sudden that places pressure on the biotech industry to shift its resources towards development activities right off the get-go. Okay, so you can't just say, here's a neat technology. You have to already in your story present that technology of how you're going to get to the clinic in the first 3 years of your existence. Okay. Most of the tool companies that were out there in the late 90s that maybe raised some money, most of those are morphing towards becoming drug discovery companies. Okay, because they're having a tough time, finding partners for their technologies. You need larger rounds of financing to cover clinical costs. Okay, so one thing that's important to know is if I spend $800 million, how much of that money is going to research, how much of that money is going to development or clinical costs? Well, research is about 15, maybe 20% maximum of that $800 million. So you're looking at 100 to 150 million is actually research costs, okay, to get that drug to the clinic, okay? The rest of that money, it goes into clinical trial costs, the cost of putting patients on the study. The average cost of a patient is probably on the order of $6,000 to $10,000, goes to each, not to the patient directly, but goes to the doctor's institution to be able to treat a patient on an investigational new drug. So you need more money. If you're going to have drugs moved to the clinic, in these small companies, in these biotech companies, they're going to have to raise larger rounds of money. The VCs are going to have to be prepared to put larger amounts of money in. And they have. In general, the rounds that have been procured by companies have tended to be $25 to $50 or $60 million over the last couple of years. So they're placing fewer bets, doing more due diligence on the companies, making sure the company really does have something for the clinic. What are some potential pitfalls? So again, if you're out there looking at, the myriad of companies, and there's over 1,700 private biotech companies, okay, around the world today, over 1,700. There's another over 500 that are public. So you've got a lot of homework to do if you're trying to figure out, where to place your bets, okay? So is the first product candidate truly the most promising? There's a lot of pressure. Companies are under a lot of pressure to get to the next round of financing, okay? Are they moving products to the clinic too soon? Are they fostering more Me Too products and not really innovative products just because they can, make more of a generic type product because they can, get some revenue? So the environment, unfortunately, is making it so that some companies are looking more like a generic company. At the same time, you're sacrificing technical platforms. Okay, the industry was born on the basis of all the technology that's here today. And that technology is being sacrificed because people aren't willing to pay a premium dollar today for that technology. Again, it's all moving towards the clinic. Another thing is companies in general, because they don't have development capability, they have mainly people that are technical oriented, scientists with PhDs. A lot of them don't have PhDs with pharmacology backgrounds to be able to do the preclinical testing or the animal model testing. Animal model testing in general tends to be fairly expensive. You have to house the animals, you have to make sure you treat the animals good, even if it's a mouse or a rat. You have to take good care of it. So a lot of companies have to outsource. So there's a lot of outsourcing. So when you put your company together, you really have to look closely at what technologies you can afford to have in the company, what technologies you're going to need access to, and make sure that you can get contracts with those outside companies to bring your products to market. Well, what are some of the operational success factors as some of these companies change? Well, some of the companies that are tool companies, as I said, that are trying to become drug discovery companies, are trying to add in preclinical pharmacology. They're trying to add in development staff that have regulatory people to go and meet with the FDA, that have physicians that will actually go and meet with physicians at medical universities to set up the clinical trials. So there's a question of fungibility of existing staff, okay? The worst thing to do is to have a small startup with about 40 or 50 people and decide that you have to lay half of them off because they really don't have the expertise that you need to move a product forward, okay? So that's really debilitating. In a startup environment, the other 25 begin to wonder when they see their other 25 compatriots let out the door, and many of which are highly qualified. It's just that they have to make way because the budget will only accommodate so many people, and they're forced to move products early. Hiring skilled development staff, people who have actually taken a drug to the clinic. So another thing is the industry, although it's almost 3 decades old today, remember this process of getting a drug from discovery into the market is 15 years long. So the pipeline process, as that's described, you've really only been through 2 cycles. So it's a fairly immature industry. There are not a lot of people that have taken a drug into the clinic. So there's not a lot of expertise. So there's a lot of companies out there vying for, not much expertise in the clinical side. Managing the potential for increased operating and project costs. Well, we just discussed those. Moving things into the clinic costs more. Well, what are some of the other strategic and operational hurdles? Corporate culture, technical versus therapeutic. Okay, so these are things that when you go into a business, businesses set up cultures. Okay, if you've got a bunch of chemists in a company, they're going to want to do things from a chemistry background and a chemistry perspective. If you have a bunch of biologists in the company, the biologists are going to want to run the show, and it's going to be run from a biology perspective. So I learned that even at Amgen. Okay, when I led Amgen and put chemistry into place in 1994, there was a clash within a company that was already a couple thousand people large, because we were basically a protein company. And now all of a sudden we were bringing chemists in. Chemists from the pharmaceutical industry know how to do chemistry, and that was where they were king. So when they come in, they think they're king. And, the biologists think they're king. You get culture clashes. And those are important things to deal with. And those are the types of things. I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to hear George Rathman, who's one of the founders of the whole industry. And he was a great entrepreneur in being able to take, a milieu of people and get them to work together from a variety of different backgrounds. So the other questions to ask when you're looking at a company, well, the platform within a company, the technical platform. Okay, if all of a sudden you've got a technical platform and you've been used to selling that platform to pharma, and now all of a sudden you've got to apply that platform yourself to making drugs, is it going to be able to do a good job? Is it going to be able to characterize a product, validate it, and stratify it? Okay. Is it going to be able to evaluate in-licensed opportunities? That means if you go outside to another company and try to bring in a drug, maybe some other company's got a bunch of drugs on the shelf that they haven't been able to develop a model for. And maybe your expertise is making knockout models that we deal with a particular receptor. And therefore you have a real good opportunity to identify the drugs that have been shelved at another pharma company as potentially great prospects in a particular disease setting. VC versus corporate partner trade-offs. So there's always trade-offs in terms of getting rounds of financing. Okay, when you bring money in, I know most people are saying, well, money's king, you know. What do you want? Just give me the money. You can always print more stock. Okay, you can run the stock, but you can't make money. Okay, so product control becomes an issue. If the venture capitalists fund it, the venture capitalists want, you know, some control. If you get funding from a pharma partner, the pharma is likely going to want to control the development of the product, okay? So the trade-off is if you get VC money, VC may say, well, we want you to do it, you know, take your drug, test it in osteoporosis first. We won't tell you what centers to go to or, you know, how to run the trial because we don't know how to do that per se. But a pharma company is going to say, hey, that's what we do. We know how to develop a drug. We develop drugs in osteoporosis. So, you know, you're going to have to hand that all over to us. Dilution, okay? If you take VC money, you're going to dilute the company. You're going to actually have to mint more shares, okay? If you do a corporate deal, it's probably a licensing deal, you don't get dilution in the company. So there's a trade-off, something else that can do. Then there's product value. You know, how big is the market segment for the drug that you're envisioning here? Is it a drug for an orphan indication that is less than 200,000 patients? Okay, it's hard to think of an orphan indication that's 200,000 sounds like a pretty good sized number. But most pharma are looking at patient populations well over a couple million. Okay, I covered earlier what are the factors that are influencing biotech moving towards drugs. Well, there's a limited number of secreted factors. In fact, there hasn't been a secreted factor discovered since the mid-90s that's been in clinical testing. That is a homeostatic factor. Okay. There's a number of antibodies that have been put in the clinic, and antibodies can recognize receptors, but there's not been another hormone-like factor put in since the mid-90s. Abundance of drug targets with the genome. There's a lot of intracellular targets. The industry has a rapid adaptation of high-throughput robotics, so it can go through things fairly rapidly today. And the process is dominated by biologically driven approaches versus a chemistry-driven approach when you look at biotech. What are the hurdles developing some of these things? Limited availability of road-tested med chemists. So here we go again. I spoke just a couple minutes ago how finding people with clinical background, clinical testing background, how to test a drug, you know, how to look at a patient, make sure a patient doesn't have a toxic event, know how to properly give the drug. Well, finding med chemists. Med chemists aren't trained in academia. Med chemists, by their notation, are trained in industry. Okay, and what's different about an organic chemist or an inorganic chemist in academia versus a med chemist in the industry? Well, in the industry, when you develop a small molecule, you have to keep 4 things in mind as you're developing it. They're termed, the major term is called ADME, and it is broken out into absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. So these are 4 things the body will do when it sees a small molecule. Okay, it has to be absorbed properly, it has to be distributed properly in the body, it has to make sure that it isn't maybe metabolized right away so that it stays around for the right half-life, and then you have to make sure that it's actually excreted from the body so that it doesn't build up and become toxic. Well, a med chemist is trained to how to hang the right R groups or bells and whistles on a small molecule to make sure that it gets to the right organ, that it gets metabolized properly, and it gets excreted properly. I think I covered some of these other points already. Okay, how do you navigate in today's market? Well, I think the best way is a technical approach. This is what I've been doing, and that is basically landscape mapping, use a bunch of computer techniques to look at the 1,700 private companies and pick critical areas for investment, selecting therapeutic areas that I think will be and provide the next blockbuster drugs. Okay, so generated a number of databases to evaluate. I'll just skip through this. It'll be available, I think, through the internet. Okay, what are the investment criteria that my colleagues and I use in general when looking at it? Got to be a breakthrough technology with an enabling pipeline platform. That means got to be able to take that technology and immediately focus it on making products. Got to have strong IP in the company. You want to have licensing and partnering opportunities, and you want to have your regulatory strategy set up. That means if I make this product, what's the patient population that I'm going to treat it with, and how will I work with the FDA to get approval of that product? Got to have a strong management team, okay, people that have been there and done that. And you got to have the ability to exit. So if I put $5 million in, I'm looking to get $30 to $50 million out after a few years on my investment. In general, a company that starts in the biotech industry historically has gone public after about 5 years on average. Okay, well, how do you define breakthrough technologies? Well, they better provide solutions to various bottlenecks, okay, various problems that you see. For example, up until recently, there's not been a lot known about various neuropsychiatric diseases. There's a huge population of people that suffer from bipolar disorder, simple anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, yet we know little or nothing about the molecular basis. But over the last year, we've gained a great understanding of some of those things, and those are just now being targeted. The patient population for that, I mean, when I grew up, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, okay, it was a great movie. I don't know if many people have seen it. If you had a chance, it's a good movie to see with Jack Nicholson. But basically, you would see that, you know, the people that were presented in that case were thought as crazy, okay? That there wasn't a real biological reason for this craziness, okay? The woman who drowned 2 children in Texas, okay, bipolar patient. Okay, suffering from mania, received a message from God to kill her 2 children. Okay, these are all chemical imbalances. We now understand that correcting these chemical imbalances with drugs can, you know, put these people back on the right path. So it's really then understanding what are the opportunities. So I think the neuropsych, pain, obesity, those are areas that a lot of companies are just starting to focus on. Criteria for selecting opportunity for a novel drug, okay? Not a Me Too drug, but something that really is going to help change and eradicate a disease. A big market, okay? You want to make $1 billion in this industry, okay? If you want to be the next Amgen, you got to make $1 billion. Market growth, I gave you a couple examples of, I think, areas that the industry is moving towards. Got to have pharma interest. Remember, pharma is your partner. If pharma isn't interested in the area you're working in, that's probably not good for you. Relevant preclinical models, okay? You want to understand that perhaps you have an animal model that recapitulates what happens in a human, and that's a rare event, okay? But you want to have at least some understanding of being able to use a particular molecule in an animal model and how that might transition into human testing. And then clinical feasibility is very important. You know, that is some time given to whether or not it's going to work in a patient. And that, again, is gotten from a lot of preclinical work. Okay, I got just a couple slides left. So key for R&D investing in a startup, I think, in today's financial environment is you got to present a plan to the venture capitalists to raise money that'll demonstrate that you're likely to have something in the clinic within 3 years of their initial investment, that the technology platform provides a solution to a major bottleneck that pharma sees in the pipeline process. And the strategy overall is to become a fully integrated drug discovery company. Where do you get the technology? Well, technology traditionally comes from academia, corporate spin-offs, and the national labs. Products can come from academia, corporate, patent busting, a whole variety. Well, why is biotech here to stay and grow? 4 major reasons. There's still a large pool of unmet medical needs. As I just described to you in the neuropsych area, there's probably a patient population of 20 plus million that can be treated through the variety of different disorders that I mentioned. Obesity is a major problem in today. The number of people that are morbidly obese is well over 40 million. Okay. And biotech is more efficient and more effective at putting products into the clinic. I haven't shown you any data in this regard, but over half the products that are in clinical testing today are in clinical testing from biotech companies, not pharma companies. So pharma is increasingly partnering with biotech to meet its product needs, and advances in biotechnology are responsible for transforming the face of medicine. So new therapeutic modalities, you saw that with protein therapeutics, you're seeing it with monoclonal antibodies. Hopefully someday gene therapy will be an opportunity. And finally, personalized medicine. That means you'll get the right drug that'll be the best drug to treat the disease that you currently have. Thank you. If I've got, $70 million under management, okay? Of that 70 million, I'm going to invest about 60 million. And I'm going to have a team of about 8 people that are going to spend that other 10 million over a period of about 10 years. So I'm going to invest 60 million. I'm going to try to invest that in at least 12 to 15 companies. Okay? And of that 12 to 15 companies, I'm looking for a couple home runs. That's the 30 to 50 million on my 5 million invested. I'm looking for a double, a couple singles, a few sacrifice flies, and probably 3 or 4 where I'm not going to see a nickel on my money put in. So that's why you've got to get the 30 to 50, because there's going to be the ones at the other end that ate your 5 million, and you're not getting your money returned the day you invest it. So you got time as the value of money over time in terms of both inflation and in terms of return also. Because the investors that invest in a VC are other entrepreneurial people who've made a lot of money and put money into big funds, and those funds invest in VCs. So their clients are looking for a return on investment of over 20%. Because in general, it used to be at least in the 80s, that you could get 12 or 10 to 15% by investing in PG&E. That's an electric company, okay? That's not a growth company, it's a value company. You got half of that growth based on, about 7%, and the other half was 5% you got in a dividend. So you got to beat that. In general, 20 to 30% is what people that invest in people like myself are looking to get in return. Okay, let's take the first one. So again, historically, orphan drug status has been granted to a company who's identified a patient population with a disease that the population is less than 200,000. And the reason for going after that is the FDA, even if you don't have a patent, if you're the first to market, you get 7 years exclusivity, okay, granted to you automatically for orphan drug status. The trouble is there are many diseases that are more genetic in nature, that directly affect one gene, and the patient populations are too small for the pharma industry. Because if it takes $800 million to make a drug, okay, and you've got a patient population that you can sell it to for $10,000 a year, you do the math, 10,000 times 10,000 patients, you never get your money back. Okay, so that's the big dilemma facing pharma. Pharma says basically you can't do it. If it's not a couple million patients, pharma doesn't want to do it. The good thing is there are some opportunities in the biotech side. Because if you're, not making any money and you're making all of a sudden $100 million, that's a lot of money. The problem with that still is somebody's had to fund the $800 million in the first place to get your drug on the market. Even though $100 million revenue is a big boost from zero, you still have this perplexing problem. The third world, malaria. Malaria exists as a disease today because it's too expensive to deal with. Okay, because third world nations can't pay for it. Because vaccines are basically a penny a dose in the third world country. And it takes too much, technology is too expensive. The second question was along the lines of what technologies today do I see?
Tooling and also priorities for innovation.
Well, I think today one of the most important tools is going to be bioinformatics. Okay, systems biology are the two areas that I've focused. Okay, so what I mean by systems biology is that your body makes a bunch of different gene products, right? And these all work in concert with each other, okay? So there's different pathways of proteins that are signaling pathways. One protein signals to another protein, signals to another protein, okay? And these pathways are bifurcated, okay? They do different things in different settings, okay? So knowing which is really the right target to choose is very important. You want to choose it before it branches and sends a signal to two pathways, or do you want to reach a target that is down a single pathway? A lot of times we see drugs have toxicity because the target is picked too far up the pathway, not far enough downstream, too far up, and it then affects multiple pathways downstream, giving you a side effect, where what you need is a more specific target on a single pathway. So systems biology, the ability to build these pathways. Now, how do you build them? You build them with informatics tools, and you build them through, biochemistry, molecular biology. So I see those are two big areas. And the campus here has a big bioinformatics capability, and is looking at that, and I think they're also doing some systems work. Chips that are being, they're about a couple millimeters by a couple millimeters. And these chips are then inserted into the brains of rats. Okay, and then you can give a drug to a rat, and the electrical impulses, charges from the brain in that rat after given that particular drug, get recorded on these little chips. And the chips are wireless, and those chips then send signals back to a computer that you get different readouts. So you can begin to see where drugs are affecting animals in the brain. That's an area in the brain where we don't have a lot of, pharmacology as to how drugs operate in the brain. A lot of them we try to get to the brain, many of which we don't want to go to the brain, but we'd like to know what the effects are. So they're developing this new technology to be able to put chips in a variety of places in the brain. The nice thing about that is the animal's reusable. Okay, you're not having to sacrifice the animal, section the brain, and look, with a radioactive probe and say, oh, this particular messenger was elaborated. Because now you're using electrical signals, which are an output. That means several cells had to get together and communicate. So now also you're looking at systems approaches, because it isn't just a molecular probe, it's now a physiology. You're looking at a group of cells in the amygdala, or a particular part, there are many specific parts of the brain that need to be targeted. So that's just one example. 71's the stem cell proposition. Okay, so you've heard Irv Weissman probably give an advertisement for it, and biologists have been working on stem cells for the better part of a couple decades. In fact, Irv himself has been the sponsor or founder of a number of companies, one of which was called Systemics, which was around in the early 80s and was ultimately sold to Sandoz. And wasn't all that good. I'd say like gene therapy, I'd say there's still some time to go, in all fairness. I think people tend to think that if they're putting their money into bonds that are going to fund stem cell research, again, you're looking at probably at least another 5 to 10 years in just the research component, and then you're looking at another 5 to 10 just to get a product out of it. So you have to be realistic. I think it's a good idea. I think there are opportunities to treat diseases like Parkinson's, but I think that one has to be realistic about what that means in the long run. Interference RNA, I'm a little bit more negative. Antisense oligos have been tested, and antisense oligos are basically just a form of an interference RNA. And those have met with disaster for the last decade and a half also. Several problems. One is manufacturing, being able to make large amounts of oligonucleotides that, from time to time, you have the same procedure and yield the same batch quality. The next problem is getting uptake. Okay, remember I mentioned absorption is one of the key things. Well, oligonucleotides, getting them to the right target, getting them to the right concentration, that's another reason why gene therapy hasn't worked even well. So I think interference RNA, there was a company called Alnylam that recently went public. And from my perspective as a VC, that was taking a lot of orphans and widows to the cleaners. So, again, that's an example of a company I wouldn't consider investing in. Okay. The trade-offs between trade secrets and patents in developing a new drug. In developing a new drug, basically you should patent it because the risks are too high because you're putting so much money downstream into it that if you can't be afforded some protection and know that you're going to have that protection, then there's a huge risk. And that's why the biotech industry is, patents are so important to the industry, okay? From that perspective, because of, the amount of money you put in. The other thing is patents are granted. In fact, the U.S. is now harmonizing with Europe on patents. So the patent life will be 20 years from the day of a patent. Well, most patents, you identify the drug is still maybe 8, 9 years from the market. You're spending 8 or 9 years of your patent life with the drug back in the company, okay? So that just, so there's a lot of money being spent, and the only way to make sure that you get it is to make sure that you've had that patent granted. A lot of companies will do something that, they'll play games because they don't want to lose that 8 or 9 years exclusivity, right? And they'll try to keep it as a trade secret. Okay, Amgen, this is a great example. Amgen tried that. Genetics Institute patented or sued Amgen over erythropoietin, claiming that they had the patent. Because what they did was, we filed for the patent, but we took our time in getting the patent office to prosecute the patent. That means to get the patent to actually be, given to us. Okay, and so the 17 years doesn't start till it's granted in the U.S. So we were playing a game with, okay, how long can we wait so we make sure we can, get all that money downstream. Well, GI was a year behind us, but decided the best way was to get their patent granted early. How they did it, Lord only knows, because they're supposed to look for things that interfere, excuse me, in the patent office and catch that, but they didn't. So their patent granted. And then we had to go to litigation to get their patent invalidated and demonstrate that we were actually the first to invent, the first to conceive, the first to bring to practice.
Thank you. I think we're going to wrap up now the Q&A session. If you have any further questions, I'm sure.
Thank you very much.